She said, "You can't judge me for my past. My ex is part of my story," while still texting him every night. I said, "Absolutely. Go celebrate your history." The next morning, she found her bags packed and a one-way ticket to her ex's city. I, 32M, never thought I'd be the guy who checks his wife's phone. For 3 years of marriage and 2 years of dating before that, I trusted her completely. That trust wasn't blind. It was built on what I believed was honesty, transparency, and mutual respect. Turns out, I was living in a carefully constructed illusion. The unraveling started on a Tuesday night. Nothing dramatic, just a regular evening at home. She was on her phone more than usual, smiling at the screen with this soft expression I hadn't seen directed at me in months. When I asked who she was texting, she said it was her college friend going through a breakup. I nodded, went back to my laptop, and didn't think much of it. But then it happened again the next night. And the night after that. Always the same pattern. Dinner would end, we'd settle on the couch, and within minutes she'd be absorbed in her phone, typing away with an urgency that made my presence feel like an afterthought. The frequency was alarming, but what really got to me was the secrecy. She'd angle the screen away, lower the brightness, or suddenly lock it if I moved closer. I'm not proud of what I did next, but desperation makes you do things you never imagined. One morning while she was in the shower, I picked up her phone. My hands were shaking as I entered her passcode, our anniversary date that she'd never bothered to change. The messages were right there, no digging required. Hundreds of texts with someone saved under a woman's name. But the conversation made it clear this was a man. Her ex, specifically. The messages went back months. They weren't explicitly sexual, which somehow made it worse. They were intimate in a way that cut deeper than physical cheating. Inside jokes, good morning texts, late-night conversations about their days, their feelings, their memories together. She was sharing her emotional life with him, the parts of herself she'd stopped sharing with me. There were references to their past relationship, reminiscing about trips they'd taken, moments they'd shared. He called her by a pet name I'd never heard before. I felt sick. The room spun as I scrolled through weeks of daily conversations, each one a small betrayal. Thousands of paper cuts that collectively felt like a stab wound. They talked every single day, sometimes for hours. She'd tell him things she never told me, about her work stress, her family issues, her fears and hopes. She was essentially maintaining a parallel relationship right under my nose. I took screenshots. Not for revenge, just evidence for my own sanity. Proof that I wasn't imagining things or overreacting. Then I put the phone back exactly where I'd found it, and tried to act normal when she came out of the bathroom, her hair wrapped in a towel, completely oblivious to the fact that my world had just shattered. For 2 days, I said nothing. I needed time to think, to observe, to understand the full scope of what I was dealing with. I watched her during those 48 hours with new eyes. Every time she picked up her phone, I knew who she was talking to. Every time she smiled at the screen, I knew it was him making her happy. Every time she gave me a distracted response to something I said, I knew her mind was elsewhere. The breaking point came on Friday night. We were supposed to have a date night, something we'd been neglecting for months. I'd made reservations at the restaurant where I'd proposed, hoping to reconnect. She spent the entire dinner on her phone. When I called her out on it, she got defensive, said I was being controlling, that she was allowed to have friends. That's when I asked directly who she was texting. She hesitated for just a second too long before repeating the story about her college friend. I asked for the friend's name. She gave me one. I asked to see the conversation, keeping my voice calm and reasonable. Her face went pale, then red. She accused me of not trusting her, of being insecure, of ruining our evening. We drove home in silence, the tension so thick it was suffocating. Once inside, she went straight to the bedroom. I stayed in the living room, staring at nothing, trying to figure out what to do next. Around midnight, she came out, her expression softer. She sat next to me and started talking about communication and trust, about how relationships needed space and independence. Then she said the words that sealed everything. Her past was her past. Her ex was part of her story, and I couldn't judge her for maintaining a friendship with someone who'd been important in her life. She said it with such conviction, like she'd rehearsed this speech, like she genuinely believed she was being reasonable. She never once acknowledged the deception, the daily lies, the emotional affair that had been happening for months. I looked at her and felt nothing. Not anger, not hurt, just an empty kind of clarity. I told her she was absolutely right. I couldn't judge her past. In fact, I thought she should go celebrate her history properly. The confusion on her face would have been comical if the situation weren't so tragic. She asked what I meant. I told her we'd discuss it in the morning and went to the guest room. I didn't sleep. Instead, I spent the night making arrangements. My best friend from college worked in finance and owed me a favor from years back when I'd helped him through a rough divorce. One call, and he was on board, no questions asked. By morning, I had a plan. I got up at 6, went to our bedroom while she was still asleep, and systematically packed her belongings. Not everything. Just enough for an extended trip. Clothes, toiletries, personal items. I was methodical about it, almost calm. 3 suitcases worth of her life, neatly organized. I left her laptop, some books, and things she could easily replace. At 7, I printed out the plane ticket. One-way flight to the city where her ex lived, departing at 2 that afternoon. My friend had pulled strings to make it happen on such short notice. The ticket was non-refundable, business class. I wasn't petty about comfort, just commitment. She woke up around 8 and found me sitting in the living room, her packed bags lined up by the door, the ticket on the coffee table. Her first reaction was confusion, then disbelief, then panic. She asked what I was doing, her voice rising with each word. I kept my tone even, almost conversational. I explained that I'd seen the messages, all of them, going back months. I told her I knew about the daily conversations, the emotional intimacy, the lies. She tried to interrupt, to explain, but I held up my hand. I wasn't interested in explanations. I told her that since her ex was clearly such an important part of her story, she should go be with him. The ticket was my gift to their friendship, or relationship, or whatever she wanted to call it. She could stay with him, reconnect properly, figure out what she really wanted without the inconvenience of a husband in the way. She started crying, saying it wasn't like that she loved me, that the messages didn't mean anything. She swore she'd never physically cheated, like that was supposed to make it better. She said I was overreacting, that I was throwing away 3 years of marriage over texts. I asked her if she'd told him about our fights, our intimate moments, our private life. The silence was my answer. I asked if she'd emotionally leaned on him more than me in the past 6 months. More silence. I asked if she'd considered his feelings and opinions when making decisions that affected our marriage. She looked away. That's when I told her the rest. I'd already contacted a divorce attorney. My friend had recommended someone excellent. The papers would be filed on Monday. Our apartment was in my name, a detail I'd never thought would matter until now. She had until 1 o'clock to decide if she was taking the flight, but either way, she couldn't stay here. She begged. She pleaded. She promised to cut all contact with him, to go to counseling, to do whatever it took. She said I was being cruel, that I was making a huge mistake. She tried anger, accusing me of being controlling and abusive for making her choose. She tried guilt, reminding me of all the good times, the life we'd built together. But here's the thing about betrayal. Once you see it clearly, you can't unsee it. Every good memory was now tainted with the question of whether she'd been texting him during those moments too. Every time she'd said she loved me, I wondered if she'd said something similar to him that same day. The trust was gone, and without trust, everything else was just performance. I told her she had 4 hours. She could call family, friends, whoever she wanted. She could take the flight or not. That was her choice. But she was leaving this apartment today, one way or another. If she didn't take the flight, fine, but she'd need to figure out her own accommodations because I was done. She tried a different approach then, getting angry, telling me I was throwing away our marriage over nothing, that all couples went through rough patches. She said I was being dramatic, that in a few days I'd regret this impulsive decision. She demanded I see reason. I showed her the screenshots then, page after page of messages, all time-stamped, showing the progression of their emotional affair. I watched her face as she saw her own words reflected back at her, the intimacy she'd shared with him, the pieces of herself she'd given away. She had no defense against the evidence of her own choices. By noon, she'd made some calls. Her sister came by to help with the bags, shooting me looks of pure hatred while she loaded them into the car. She didn't know the full story, just her version where I was the villain kicking his wife out over jealousy. I didn't bother explaining. Let her think what she wanted. At 1:15, she left. I don't know if she took the flight. Part of me hoped she did. Hoped she'd go to him, and discover whether their text message intimacy could translate into real life, whether he was ready to take on the responsibility of an actual relationship instead of being the fun escape from reality. Part of me hoped she'd realize what she'd lost. Mostly, though, I just felt relieved. The apartment was quiet in a way it hadn't been in months. No tension, no lies, no wondering who she was texting. Just peace. Update 1. It's been 2 weeks since she left. I need to write this down because the aftermath has been even more surreal than the initial confrontation. She took the flight. I know this because her ex posted a photo on social media 3 days after she left. Nothing obvious, just a picture of coffee cups at some cafe in his city. But I recognized her bracelet in the corner of the frame, the one I'd given her for our first anniversary. She told me once it was her favorite piece of jewelry. Guess it still had enough meaning to wear while meeting up with him. My phone exploded for about a week. Her friends, her family, even some of our mutual acquaintances calling and messaging to tell me what a monster I was. According to the narrative she'd spread, I'd kicked her out with no warning over innocent text messages, given her no chance to explain, and essentially forced her to leave the state. The one-way ticket detail made me sound particularly villainous in her retelling. Manipulative, controlling, abusive even. I didn't defend myself publicly. What was the point? The people who mattered knew the truth or would figure it out eventually. Her sister called me 8 times before I finally answered. She screamed at me for 10 minutes straight about how I'd abandoned her sister, how cruel I was, how she'd always known I wasn't good enough. I let her finish, then asked if she'd like to see the messages that showed months of emotional cheating. The line went quiet. She hung up without another word. The divorce attorney I'd consulted turned out to be as good as advertised. A woman in her 50s with sharp eyes and sharper instincts. She'd seen it all and had no patience for drama. During our first official meeting, she asked me point blank if I wanted to drag this out or handle it cleanly. I said clean. She nodded approvingly. Since we had no kids and I could prove the emotional affair, she said we had a straightforward case. The apartment was mine. Our shared savings would be split, but since I'd been the primary earner and could demonstrate she'd been living beyond her means on my income, the division would favor me. She asked if I wanted to pursue anything regarding the breach of trust or emotional damages. I said no. I just wanted it over. My ex tried to contact me exactly once during those 2 weeks. A long email that arrived at 3 in the morning, clearly written in some emotional state. She said she was sorry, that she'd made mistakes, but so had I, that we'd grown apart, and she'd sought comfort elsewhere, but never meant to hurt me. She said the thing with her ex wasn't what I thought, that they were just friends reconnecting, that I'd read too much into innocent conversations. The email went on for pages, oscillating between apologetic and accusatory. She blamed my work hours, my emotional distance, my lack of interest in her life. She said she'd tried to talk to me about our problems, but I never listened. She said I'd changed, become cold and distant, and she'd needed someone to talk to. She said she'd been planning to end things with him, that she'd just needed time to figure out how to do it without hurting his feelings. That last part almost made me laugh. She'd been worried about hurting his feelings while destroying our marriage. I didn't respond. My attorney advised against any communication outside of legal channels, and honestly, I had nothing to say. Everything worth saying. I'd said that morning with the packed bags and plane ticket. What surprised me was my own emotional state. I expected to fall apart, to spiral into depression or rage. Instead, I felt lighter than I had in months. The constant low-level anxiety that had become my baseline, wondering why she was distant, why conversations felt forced, why I felt like I was competing for her attention, all of that was gone. The apartment felt like mine again, not like a space I was sharing with a stranger wearing my wife's face. I threw myself into work, picked up the hobbies I'd abandoned, reconnected with friends I'd neglected. One of my buddies pointed out that I smiled more now than I had in the past year. I hadn't even realized I'd stopped smiling. Work became a refuge. My boss noticed the change in my energy and offered me a project I'd been passed over for before, something high-profile that would mean longer hours but serious career advancement. Before, I would have declined, worried about how it would affect my marriage. Now, I accepted without hesitation. The guys I played basketball with on weekends mentioned I was playing better, more aggressive, more focused. One of them asked if I'd been training. I told them I'd just removed some dead weight from my life. They laughed, not knowing how literal I was being. I also started seeing a therapist. Not because I was falling apart, but because I wanted to understand how I'd missed the signs for so long, how I'd let myself be so blind to what was happening in my own marriage. The therapist, a guy in his 60s who looked like he should be teaching philosophy, asked me pointed questions that made me uncomfortable but helped me see patterns I'd been ignoring. He asked if this was the first time she'd been secretive. I realized it wasn't. There had been other times, smaller things I'd dismissed. A coworker she'd mentioned too often, a weekend trip with friends that had seemed suspicious, late nights at the office that didn't match her work schedule. I'd trusted her explanations because I'd wanted to, because questioning them felt like being paranoid. The therapist told me something that stuck with me. Trust isn't the same as willful blindness. Real trust is built on consistent honesty and transparency, not on ignoring red flags because you're afraid of being the jealous husband. I'd confused the two, and it had cost me. Update 2. A month in now. The divorce papers were served last week while she was still at her ex's place. I know this because her sister called me again, this time with a different tone. Less angry, more concerned. She said her sister had been staying with the ex, but things weren't going well, that he'd apparently been shocked when she showed up and expected to stay indefinitely. Turns out, their text message romance was easier to maintain when it was fantasy, not reality. According to the sister, the ex had a whole life she didn't know about. He'd been casually dating other people, wasn't looking for anything serious, and definitely hadn't been expecting his ex-girlfriend to arrive with 3 suitcases and relationship expectations. The sister said she seemed lost, that she'd been crashing on his couch for a week before he'd gently suggested she find her own place. I felt nothing hearing this. No satisfaction, no vindication, not even pity. Just a distant curiosity, like hearing about a stranger's problems. The sister asked if she could come back, if we could work things out. I asked if she was serious. She said her sister had made mistakes, but everyone deserved a second chance, that marriage was about forgiveness. I told her that forgiveness didn't mean reconciliation, and that ship had sailed the moment she'd chosen to maintain a secret emotional affair for months. Then I asked the sister a question. If her husband was texting another woman every night, sharing intimate details of his life, seeking emotional comfort from someone else while treating their marriage like an afterthought, would she be okay with it? Silence. That was my answer. The divorce was proceeding smoothly. My ex had initially pushed back on the terms, wanting a larger share of our assets, but her attorney apparently talked sense into her. With the documented evidence of the affair and my ability to prove I'd been the primary financial contributor, she wasn't in a strong negotiating position. We settled on a 60-40 split in my favor, which my attorney said was generous given the circumstances. My life had developed a new rhythm. Work, gym, therapy, friends. I'd started dating casually, nothing serious, just coffee or dinner with women I met through apps or mutual friends. It felt strange at first, being back in that world after 5 years off the market. But it was also exciting in a way I'd forgotten was possible. One woman I'd gone on 3 dates with asked me why I'd gotten divorced. I gave her the short version: irreconcilable differences, grew apart, the usual lines. She looked at me skeptically and said I didn't seem like someone who gave up easily. I appreciated that she could read between the lines, but didn't push for details. Later that night, I told her the truth. Not all of it, but enough. She listened without judgment, then said something that caught me off guard. She asked if I regretted how I'd handled it, if I wished I'd tried counseling first. I thought about it, really thought about it, and realized I didn't. The thing was, the emotional affair wasn't a one-time mistake or a momentary lapse in judgment. It was a sustained choice she'd made every single day for months. Every night, she'd texted him instead of talking to me. Every time she'd shared her feelings with him instead of her husband. Every lie she'd told to cover her tracks. Those were all deliberate decisions. Counseling might have saved a marriage, but it couldn't have restored the person I'd thought I married. My ex tried calling me directly a few days ago. I didn't answer. She left a voicemail asking if we could meet to talk, saying she'd made terrible mistakes and wanted a chance to explain properly. She said she'd been confused and scared, that she'd never stopped loving me, that the thing with her ex had been a fantasy that fell apart the moment it became real. She asked if there was any possibility of us trying again. I deleted the voicemail without finishing it. My attorney sent her a formal cease and desist letter, reminding her that all communication needed to go through legal channels. Update 3. 6 weeks. The divorce was finalized yesterday. Fastest dissolution I'd heard of, according to my attorney. But we had all the elements for a quick process. No kids, clear evidence of cause, and ultimately minimal assets to divide. I signed the papers in her office. A simple signature that ended 5 years of my life. She asked how I felt. I said relieved. She smiled and said that was the healthiest response she'd heard in a while. My ex had signed remotely, apparently from her sister's place. She'd left her ex's city 2 weeks ago after things had completely fallen apart. The fantasy she'd built up in her head through months of texting had crashed hard against reality. Turns out he wasn't interested in being anyone's savior or second choice, just a guy who'd enjoyed having an ego boost from an ex who reached out. I heard through mutual friends that she was devastated, saying she'd lost everything, that she'd made the biggest mistake of her life. She'd been asking people if they thought there was any chance I'd take her back. They told her no. She apparently didn't believe them and kept asking, like eventually someone would tell her what she wanted to hear. What's interesting is how different I felt now versus a month ago. The raw wound had scabbed over, and underneath was just scar tissue, a reminder of what happened, but not something that hurt anymore. I discovered something important. I didn't miss her. I missed the idea of her, the person I'd thought she was, but not the reality of who she'd actually been. My therapist said something in our last session that crystallized everything. He said some people maintain double lives not because they're malicious, but because they're cowards. They want the security and stability of one relationship and the excitement and validation of another. They convince themselves they're not really cheating as long as it stays emotional or digital. They tell themselves they're just confused or going through something. But really, they're just too scared to choose, so they try to have everything while risking nothing. That was her. She'd wanted the stable home and financial security I provided while getting emotional fulfillment and excitement from him. She'd wanted to keep her options open, maintain her backup plan, never fully commit to either reality. And when forced to actually choose, when her fantasy crashed into real life, she'd realized she'd miscalculated everything. I ran into one of her friends at the grocery store last week. She'd always been civil to me, even after everything, which I appreciated. She stopped me in the produce section and asked if I was doing okay. I said I was. She nodded, then said something unexpected. She was sorry for not seeing what was happening, for not saying something sooner. She said she'd noticed her friend had been distant and secretive, but had chalked it up to normal relationship struggles. Then she told me that she'd seen the full extent of the messages after everything came out. She said she'd been horrified, that it was so much worse than she'd thought. She said if her partner had done something similar, she'd have done exactly what I did, maybe worse. She said she respected how I'd handled it, clean, decisive, no public drama or revenge. She said I deserved better, and she was confident I'd find it. That validation from someone in her circle meant more than I expected. It confirmed I wasn't crazy, wasn't overreacting, wasn't the villain in this story. The apartment felt different now. I'd changed some things, new furniture, different layout, fresh paint in a few rooms. Making it mine, erasing the ghost of our life together. My buddy helped me haul away the couch where she used to spend hours texting him. We replaced it with a new one, better quality, more comfortable. Symbolic, maybe, but it mattered. I'd started seeing someone new, the woman I'd been on a few dates with. Nothing serious yet, just enjoying each other's company without pressure or expectations. She knew my story, knew I was freshly divorced, and wasn't pushing for more than I could give. It was healthy, honest, uncomplicated in a way my marriage never had been. We were having dinner last week when she asked if I'd ever forgive my ex. I thought about it, really considered the question. I told her I probably already had, in the sense that I didn't carry anger or wish her harm. But forgiveness didn't mean forgetting, and it didn't mean opening the door to someone who'd proven they couldn't be trusted. She'd made her choices, and I'd made mine. We both had to live with the consequences. The woman reached across the table and squeezed my hand. She said she hoped when I was ready to trust again, someone would deserve it this time. Looking back, the packed bags and one-way ticket might have seemed dramatic or cruel to outside observers. But sometimes the kindest thing you can do for everyone involved is to end things quickly and definitively. No drawn-out fights, no false reconciliations, no years of resentment building into toxicity. Just a clean break, painful but necessary, like ripping off a bandage. My ex had wanted to have her cake and eat it too. wanted to keep me as the stable foundation while exploring what else was out there. The ticket forced her to confront the reality of her choices, to actually face what she'd been building with him instead of keeping it as a safe fantasy. It hadn't worked out for her, but that wasn't my problem anymore. I'd chosen myself, chosen my dignity, chosen a future that wasn't built on lies and half-truths. That morning, standing in the living room with her packed bags lined up by the door, I'd drawn a line. On one side was who I'd been, trusting to the point of willful blindness, conflict-averse, willing to overlook red flags for the sake of peace. On the other side was who I needed to be, someone with clear boundaries, someone who valued themselves enough to walk away from disrespect, someone who understood that love without honesty wasn't love at all. The plane ticket was never about revenge. It was about consequences. She'd built a connection with someone else while married to me, maintained it daily, lied repeatedly to protect it. When confronted, she'd tried to minimize it, to make it my problem for not understanding, to rewrite reality where she was the victim of my jealousy rather than the architect of her own betrayal. The ticket simply gave her what she'd been working toward, a chance to be with the person she'd chosen to prioritize over her husband. That she'd discovered the fantasy didn't match reality? That was her lesson to learn, not mine to prevent. Sometimes people need to face the full consequences of their choices to understand what they've actually done. I'm not the same person I was 6 weeks ago. I'm clearer, stronger, less willing to accept behavior that disrespects me. The marriage might have ended, but I'd gained something more valuable, self-respect, and the knowledge that I could survive betrayal without becoming bitter or broken. My ex is living with her sister now, according to what I hear through the grapevine, trying to rebuild her life, figure out what comes next. I hope she learns from this. Hope she becomes honest with the next person she's with. Hope she figures out how to be in a relationship without needing backup plans and escape routes. As for me, I'm moving forward. New job project kicking off next month. New relationship developing naturally, new life taking shape. The apartment that used to feel haunted by lies now feels peaceful. The phone that used to buzz with her messages stays quiet, and that silence is a gift. I'd done what needed to be done, handled it in a way I could live with, and came out the other side intact. That was enough.